Our next speaker is Andrea Moro from Vanderbilt University, who will present Exclusion of Extreme Jurors and Minority Representation, the Effect of Jury Selection Procedures.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for staying on a Saturday afternoon. The paper is joined with Martin van der Linden from Emory, and we are going to study the selection of jurors in US criminal trials. The Sixth Amendment of the US Constitution guarantees the right to a trial by an impartial jury. And this right, one way at least that this right is satisfied is by giving the defense and the plaintiff the right to exercise peremptory challenges, which are challenges to dismiss jurors without a stated reason. Although they cannot use simply race or gender, but they don't have to provide any reason. So this is actually kind of hard to enforce. And what we do, we study two types of procedures that are discussed and that are used in practice. Struck procedures are procedures that present all prospective jurors to the parties who can interview the jurors in a process called voir dire. And in struck procedure, the jurors are presented before the parties can exercise their challenges. Under struck and replace procedures instead, jurors are presented one by one or in small group, but in principle, they can be presented one by one, forcing the parties to make challenge decisions without information about jurors to be presented next. And there's an active debate in the legal scholarship about the ability of either system to either exclude jurors with extremes of partiality, which seems to be one of the reasons behind the constitutional norm, and the other goal in the legal scholarship that the procedures should satisfy is to guarantee group representation. So the legal scholarship debates between these two goals. And so in this paper, we're going to compare these two types of procedures in terms of these two goals, the exclusion of extremes and the group representation. We're going to perform a qualitative analytical comparison by proving some limit results in theory. We're going to use some simulations to assess the size of the effects and to understand when limit results start to bite. And in work in progress, we're trying to estimate model parameters with data to assess the potential impact of procedural reform. And to give you a sense of how we think about this problem, I'm going to just describe the model, which we draw from a literature that dates back to the 70s. In the model, there's a jury of J jurors to be formed. The defense and the plaintiff are allowed a number of challenges. And so they start off with a panel of potential jurors, which is the number of jurors to be seated, plus the number of challenges that the parties have. And each juror from group G draws a conviction probability from some distribution which we allow to be different by group. And this conviction probability is initially unobserved by the two parties. And the goal of the parties is to either minimize, that's the defense wants to minimize, the prosecution wants to maximize the probability of conviction, which we assume to be the product of the conviction probabilities of all the jurors. So we assume that unanimity is required, which is true in most jurisdictions, not all though. And also we sort of ignore what happens during jury deliberations. Again, we follow the literature here, so that is sort of a black box, and it's one of the limitations of the theory here. And under the two procedures, the struck procedure, defense and prosecution will observe the conviction probability of everyone in the jury pool before they make all the challenges, and the unchallenged jurors will form the effective jury. Under the strike and replace, parties observe the conviction probability of one member at a time. The juror is seated if no one challenges, and the process continues until all jurors are seated. The equilibrium strategies are quite simple under the struck procedures. All jurors are observed at once before the choice, so the defense will challenge the most extreme jurors in favor of conviction. The prosecutor will challenge the jurors with the lowest probability of convicting, and the jurors in the middle of the distributions will be seated. The strike and replace has a more interesting structure because there's this dynamic process of trying to guess who comes up next. And so this is a problem which has been solved in the past. you can define a recursive structure, and essentially the optimal the equilibrium strategy is defined by thresholds, one for the prosecution and one for the defense in any subgame. A subgame is defined by the number of jurors left to be selected and the number of challenges left by the two parties. And so depending on the subgame, there's going to be different thresholds. The prosecution challenges obviously those who are below that threshold, and the defense will challenge people who are above the threshold. So I'm going to give you, in the interest of time, I'm going to give you a summary of the main theoretical results without showing you much of the algebra. In terms of the exclusion of extremes, we need first to define what we mean by extreme. And we define an extreme juror, a juror below, with a conviction probability below or above an arbitrary threshold. And under this definition, we prove that struck is more likely to exclude extreme jurors than strike and replace, in the limit as the threshold to define somebody as extreme converges to the edges of the domain of the distribution. We also prove that struck is more likely to exclude extreme jurors than random choice, but that is not true even in the limit for strike and replace. We found actually a rather extreme counterexample where strike and replace selects fewer extreme jurors than random choice. In terms of minority representation, we need to add more structure, and we define polarized groups where by polarization, we mean a situation where members of one group favor conviction more than members of the other group. And we prove that if the minority is small enough, in the limit as groups become more polarized in the sense that the distributions do not overlap, and strike and replace selects more minorities than struck. Okay, so in a sense, there's a trade-off. Struck selects more extremes, is more capable. Sorry, struck is able to select fewer extremes, but strike and replace instead selects more minorities. So there's a trade-off between these two goals. And to give you an intuition for this result, first of all, for excluding extremes, let's think about the situation where there's only one juror to be seated and only one challenged by the prosecution. So the pool size is 2 people. Okay, for the struck procedure to select an extreme juror in this case, both jurors must be below the threshold. So we're looking at extremes at the bottom, but the symmetric argument occurs for extremes at the top. So in this case, the prosecution will strike the worst juror, and then one will be left to be seated on the jury. If the area is P, this occurs with probability P squared. Under strike and replace, instead, we might have a situation in which there are 2 jurors. One is extreme under the same definition. One is not so extreme, but has a conviction probability below the threshold for the prosecution. And in that case, if juror number 1 here is presented first, the prosecutor will challenge this juror, and then the juror number 2 will be seated on the jury. Juror number 2 is extreme. He would not have been seated if under struck, because the prosecution would have seen that the second juror was worse. And so now the probability that this occurs is P times Q, which as C converges to 0, P times Q goes to 0 more slowly than P squared. And so strike and replace will end up with more, on average, with more extreme jurors than struck. And in a sense, another way to understand this is that under strike and replace, you don't need 2 jurors below the threshold to draw an extreme. Okay, you just need to have to run out. Essentially, you need to run out of challenges, and then at the end, a very extreme juror may appear. And the intuition behind the result, behind the minority representation, the idea that strike and replace will select more minorities, is sort of follows a similar argument, because when essentially we require parties to be polarized. So, for example, minorities are on one side, and then the dominant group or the majority group is on the other side. As the groups become more polarized and as the minorities become smaller, then essentially minorities will end up at the edge of the distribution, where we know that strike and replace is capable of selecting more people. So to summarize, we formally proved the kind of trade-off between these two procedures by providing more information. Struck is more effective than struck and replaced at excluding extremes, but includes fewer minorities. With simulations in the paper, we show that depending on parameters, the two procedures can produce quite different outcomes. And I'm going to show you some of these simulations. And actually, I will show you results based on some preliminary work that we do by trying to estimate some modeled parameters from the data. So we're trying to sort of estimate these distributions of conviction probabilities using moments from the data. And to give you an idea of how we can do that, so first of all, we assume some parametric form for the distributions of conviction probability. We assume that the conviction probabilities follow a beta distribution. So there are 4 parameters to estimate, 2 for whites and 2 for blacks. This is just an example of 2 beta distributions for blacks and whites. So the 4 parameters of these 2 beta distributions govern important moments from the data. First of all, they govern the location of the joint average. You can shift these distributions to the right. What this does is to increase the conviction frequencies. You can also move the parameters to change the mass of the 2 distributions at the tail. So if you make, for example, the whites distribution a little thicker here, then the prosecution will challenge more whites. Okay, so this will govern the percentage of whites struck by the defense and the other this tail, the defense, and this tail, the prosecution. And also you can govern the relative mass of the 2 distributions in the middle, which essentially affects how the number of whites in the jury increases or decreases the probability of somebody being found guilty. And so we use a simulated method of moments to match these data. And to give you an idea of how these moments look in the data that we found, which come from an investigative journalism research, if you look at trials against black defendants, about 83% of people are found guilty in these trials. There's a strong correlation between the fraction of whites in jury and convictions, okay, strong and statistically significant. And then in terms of challenge statistics, there's strong behavior. The behavior strongly depends on race. There's about 2/3 of whites in the jury pool, but over 90% of whites are among those struck by the defense. And among the jurors struck by the state, only 20% are white. So that's a sign that the parties really believe that the groups are polarized in their preferences for conviction. So we use these moments now to match the beta distributions from theory, and I'm going to skip the parameter estimates, which are not very interesting. I'm just going to give you two statistics from the estimates. The average conviction probability of blacks is 75%. The average conviction probability of whites is 99%. We need these very high numbers. I have 12 minutes. So okay. So let me show you then under these estimates how these 2 procedures perform, because now we can simulate results, we can simulate outcomes from many juries. And this chart shows the fraction of juries with extreme jurors, jurors below a certain threshold, and strike and replace is capable of, and we'll end up with including a lot more extreme jurors than struck procedures. We can also run simulations by varying the number of challenges by looking to see how potential reforms may change the fraction of extreme in juries. Again, strike and replace will have more extreme jurors, but you can decrease it by increasing the number of challenges. And in terms of minority representation, if you keep the number of challenges we found that we have in our data, 6, if you reform and you move from the struck procedure that was used in this trial to a strike and replace, you would have 4% more minorities in juries and 8% more juries with at least the fraction of blacks that we find in the jury pool. And this, if you go and compute how many people end up being convicted, there are strong effects, because we have, if you remember, 83% of convictions in the data. Under strike and replace, you would have 10% fewer convictions of these black defendants. And so to conclude, I'm going to skip some results here. To conclude, we find that when jurors' preferences are polarized, Theory predicts a trade-off between the goals discussed in the legal scholarship because struct procedures are effective at excluding extremes, but do not ensure the same minority representation. And when preferences are estimated to match moments from data, we find that this trade-off is economically relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, we have about 1 minute for any questions.
I think there was a clarification question in the chat.
Nicholas just asked one in the chat. So this is a very interesting question. Presumably, if we just did random selection, we would tend to have more minorities / extremes than either procedure.
We found that, so let me try to remember. Maybe we can move this. It's rather technical, so we can chat it up. We can move it offline. So we find that, so in terms of extremes, we find that struct is more likely to exclude extreme than random choice. But we found a counterexample for strike and replace. It's a rather extreme example, though. So it's quite, we think it's quite unlikely. It requires the distributions to have discontinuous support. But
Okay.
Anyway, you can check the paper for the details.
Thank you for the discussion. So our last speaker today is Sebastian Perez Salazar from Georgia Tech, and he will be presenting Preserving Diversity when Partitioning a Geometric Approach.